in the audience has been helped using a low-carb, high-fat diet? It might be that you've lost weight, you've improved your health markers, you feel better, or it might be something else. There's all different reasons for doing a LCHF, low-carb, high-fat. So again, I don't want to embarrass anybody, but if you've been helped by LCHF, either stand up or raise your hand and wave so other people can see. These are the people who use the diet and appreciate. Some of them might be willing to talk about it if you haven't tried it. So getting on here, I'm not a good extemporaneous speaker. I have to use my notes. Our next speaker was doing studies back in the 70s, checking out ketogenic diets. He's way ahead of us on these topics. He's eloquent and passionate and loves introducing LCHF to more people. He's written many books, studies, and papers, including several with some of our other speakers here today. As well as being a physician, he's an emeritus professor at the University of California, Davis. And I'd also like to thank him for coming such a long way to be here with us. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Steve Phinney.
Which is forward and switch is back here. I always, right-hand side is forward.
Last one? Right-hand side?
Yeah, okay, good.
Okay, there you go.
Thanks. So I'm delighted to be here and to maybe have persisted in this field long enough to be addressing this type of audience, because I figure this type of audience is maybe half people are converts and the other half of people are maybe ready to look more objectively at the data, that this is where we're going to have impact on people's lives. When I talk to my academic colleagues who have a strong vested interest in maintaining the status quo, I have a much lower yield in terms of response, and I get more tomatoes thrown at me in those settings as well. What I want to talk about today is inflammation and how it relates to disease and how that might be related to carbohydrate restriction. Now, the organizers did not speak to my wife before they gave me this topic, and I comment on that because she likes to say that if you ask him how to get to the Bay Bridge, from Oakland to San Francisco, he's not going to give you directions. He's going to tell you how to build the bridge. And this is not a good thing where you only have 45 minutes to cover a topic like inflammation. So I apologize. I am going to try very hard to stay away from detail, but I want to give you a sense of why this works and how it works, not just what to do. And to start with, when I was in medical school and I was taught about inflammation, I was taught so long ago they still use Latin terms. And so we were told that inflammation was a combination of three symptoms, which was calor, rubor, and dolor, meaning redness, heat, and pain. And so if you had redness, heat, and pain, either locally or systemically, that was inflammation. Well, inflammation turns out to be much more nuanced than that. And what we were taught was the high-grade kind of inflammation. Fever, leukocytosis means a very high white blood cell count, and 100-fold elevations in some of the more modern biomarkers of inflammation, like C-reactive protein, called CRP. So this is what you still find in the textbooks. Low-grade inflammation, there's no name for it. I had to come up with a name, and nobody has adopted it because it's hard to pronounce, but I came up with the term constitutive. So high-grade inflammation is you're going down Highway 101 here at 93 miles an hour and you get a ticket because you're driving your car at 93 miles an hour on the highway. Low-grade inflammation is like the speed the engine is going in your car when it's idling. And so differences in low-grade inflammation between an idling speed of like 500 RPM, your car's going put, 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 put when it's idling, versus but not running. So this is what your body's inflammatory response is doing when it's on idle. And I was taught that there is a normal range, and you could, when you get a white blood cell count from doing a complete blood count on someone, and you'll see the white blood cell count in a normal range, and you say, oh, that's okay. They're somewhere between 5 and 10. Or the CRP is in a normal range, or something called interleukin-6, that these things have normal ranges, and everything in that normal range is okay. And that's really where we were until people started to try to, scientists and physicians started to get their head around a problem with heart disease. And that is, we've known since probably the 1960s and 70s that a lot of heart attacks are associated with elevated cholesterol levels in the blood. And when you look at it statistically, about half of all heart attacks occur in the quarter of people with the highest cholesterol levels. And that's what drove this whole lipid hypothesis of diet and heart disease, that having a high cholesterol level was associated with the high risk of heart disease. But the kind of the sleeper here was that the other half of heart attacks occurred in people who had normal cholesterol levels, what was considered normal cholesterol levels. And so that was really a conundrum, and even when they isolated factors like smoking, central obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, things we now call metabolic syndrome, it still didn't fully explain the normal, or the occurrence of heart attacks in people with normal LDL cholesterols. And that was really a puzzle. So why did, quote, normal people have heart attacks? And the first glimpse of this came when the guy named William B. Cannell, who was director of the Framingham Heart Study, and this study that focused on the then village in Massachusetts called Framingham. They had about 5,000 people when they first started in the 1950s. They examined these people, and then their progeny, now the grandchildren, in terms of all factors, exercise, dietary intake, and so on and so forth. And they were focusing on the cholesterol thing. But when he retired from leading the project, he started looking a little more broadly and kind of digging through the data, and he came up with the fact that changes in the level of total white blood cell count within the normal range, what we consider normal, was a marker of increased, or was associated with increased cardiovascular disease. And for non-smoking men, for each 1.0 from between 5 and 10, that the number is 10 to billion white blood cells, each 1.0 difference up, as it went up from 5 to 6 to 7 to 8 to 9 to 10, you had a 32% rise for each one. So if you had a value of 5 versus a value of 10, you increased your risk of heart attack by 150%, independent of your cholesterol level. And that's where people began to think of, well, maybe inflammation is a little more complex than just really high, speeding and getting a ticket versus your car idling at kind of a normal, sitting in the parking lot. Now, is it just heart disease? Well, Dr. Westman already mentioned, and Dr. Wortman as well, that risk of developing type 2 diabetes has been seen to be associated with markers of inflammation. And so when they looked at the women's health study, which Dr. Wortman pointed out cost almost as much as sending humans to the moon, if you divide it up in quartiles, so you took the upper quarter of CRP versus the lowest quarter, the upper quarter had almost 16 times, not 16%, 16 times a greater incidence of subsequent incidence of type 2 diabetes. If you use IL-6, it was only 7.5 times. So either of these two markers is associated with the risk. So they're looking at the blood values before they have any overt signs of this disease. And so this is an extremely potent predictor of risk of developing type 2 diabetes. For four cancers, it's actually expanded now since I made this slide, but lung, colon, breast, and uterus are all positively correlated with increased biomarkers of inflammation. And in the case of the study by Margolis et al., they used white blood cell count, and by Lee et al., they were using CRP. So major diseases are predicted by biomarkers of inflammation. And these are biomarkers that are within or very close to what we previously called normal. So it's a much more nuanced picture, and it's much more important to understand what this is and why it is, why people respond and why they vary. If we want to look at preventing some of the major killers that we deal with. So what are the biomarkers? This is the short list. If I gave you the long list, it would be like one of Dr. Wortman's slides where he buzzed through 6 pages. Total white blood cell count is kind of a blunt tool, but it's readily available. You can find this in any patient's medical chart. If you want to get into that, you actually, rather than taking the total white blood cell count, you take the absolute number of the granulocytes, or PMNs, in the total white blood cell count. CRP, most physicians can order this now as a routine clinical test. IL-6 is available. Fibrinogen, which is part of the blood clotting cascade, is also a biomarker of inflammation. Something called serum amyloid A, a little bit less easy to order. And then there are these 15 other candidate biomarkers. Why do we have such a long list? Because no one of these is the perfect biomarker. And if you want to look at this from a research perspective, I'll show you a slide later on from Dr. Volick's lab, being the consummate scientist it is. He basically carpet bombed the thing by at each time point for each patient, he assayed 14 different biomarkers in order to get the complex pattern of this inflammatory response that we multicell organisms have evolved over 1 billion years. Nature, given nature 1 billion years, she can become really complex, and she has. So the ones we most commonly use, IL-6, CRP, total white blood cell count, but understand there are others, and each of them has its own positives and negatives. Now, I'm a physician and a nutritionist. I was trained to write prescriptions and give people drugs. I want to show you one drug study. This was a study that was done by Paul Ridker and group at Harvard. Ridker, truth be known, is the guy who developed the super sensitive assay for CRP that made it a useful test, because the test we used to have only measured abnormally high values. He developed the test and patented the test that can measure these variations in what we used to call the normal range. And he makes money every time we order that test because he has a patent on it. But that said, he's done some absolutely brilliant research in bringing people kicking and screaming into the understanding of this field a little more. He did a study called the Jupiter study. They recruited almost 18,000 adults who had relatively low LDLs, less than 130, but CRPs at 2.0 or above. The quote normal range we used to have was from, I think, 0.4 to 2.2. So if you're above 2, it's like the top 8 or 10% of people in that normal range, what used to be called normal range. And they randomized them to either a placebo or to take 20 milligrams of a statin drug, rosuvastatin, which is one of the more modern statins, which doesn't just lower LDL, but it also has anti-inflammatory properties. So he was using the statin here to take people with relatively low LDLs, not particularly high LDLs. He was targeting trying to lower CRP. When they ran the study, they were planning to run it for 5 years. They stopped after 1.9 years because they had such a dramatic effect on outcome. And for cardiovascular events, stroke, or cardiovascular death, the hazard ratio, which is the ratio of the likelihood of having it if you were in the treated group versus the placebo group, was 0.53. So they cut the event rate for cardiovascular events, stroke, or death. They cut it by almost in half. And the other thing is, you may know that in a lot of the cholesterol lowering studies, you lower heart disease a lot more than you lower actual mortality. In their study, they reduced mortality by 20% at 1.9 years. Yes, they lowered LDL, but they dropped CRP by 37%. And that's a dramatic effect on C-reactive protein. And the experts and the people with biases about cholesterol still argue, well, it was a reduction in LDL, went from lower, from not high to lower, or was it a reduction in CRP? And the answer is probably both. But when people that I trust to look at this objectively have come to the conclusion that much of a reduction in CRP had a very significant contribution to this remarkable outcome. And what it says is that CRP and inflammation in general is a therapeutic target. And almost every pharmaceutical company in the world now is investing billions of dollars in trying to get a drug that's going to knock this thing down here. So what medications do we have that can lower CRP? Right now, the only, in terms of, quote, safe for chronic use, that is, I'm allowed to write a prescription for that, are the statins. Maybe high-dose non-steroidal anti-inflammatories like Motrin or Aleve. In some studies, they see a 10 to 15% reduction in CRP, but in many uses and many studies, they see no change. And the other thing I'd point out is, if you took high-dose NSAIDs every day for 10 years, what percentage of you would not have major gastrointestinal complications and even mortality from GI bleeds because of the gastric irritation and bleeding promoted by these drugs? And so, we either have statins, which do have a significant panoply of side effects when taken chronically, or high-dose NSAIDs. Other than that, there is no drug that I can write a prescription for or have you take over the counter that's going to significantly impact what my colleagues call druggable target. So what about nutrients? What effect might they have? Well, there are a number of reasons to think that nutrients in some combination of intakes or lack of intakes might have impact on outcome. And we know that higher intakes of fruits, vegetables, fish, alcohol, and olive oil are associated in populations with reductions in cardiovascular disease risk, including some complex changes in diet, like the quote Mediterranean diet. The other thing that's really intriguing is that there is no, you probably know this, there is no one vitamin E. The stuff we call vitamin E in nature exists in 7 different forms. The one that we most often associate with that term, vitamin E, is alpha tocopherol. But that's only one of 7. And it's actually one of the form that is less commonly seen occurring in nature. The one that is most commonly found in our normal diet, in the food, is called gamma tocopherol. And when you take a relatively concentrated tocopherol mix containing gamma tocopherol, and you give it to animals, as Bruce Ames did at the Oakland Children's Hospital Research Institute, you can show dramatic anti-inflammatory effects in rats. And I'm not going to bore you with my data, but I'm not my name. I worked with some really smart people, and they were nice and put my name on the paper. With gamma tocopherol given to humans in 4 different settings in which we lowered biomarkers of inflammation. Quite significantly, using gamma tocopherol alone or in combination with other nutrients. And that combination issue is important. I want to pursue that a bit as we go forwards. Another factor that we know has anti-inflammatory effects is the consumption of alcohol. This is a emotionally and sometimes religiously dangerous turf to get into, but we know that let me see my slide here. There are multiple studies that associate the consumption of alcohol with reduction in, when it's done in moderation, reduction in heart attacks and mortality. Unfortunately, there are no prospective studies. You know, even if I tried to get funding, I would never get the grant approved to actually give alcohol to non-drinkers to see if I can lower CRP and lower mortality. But there are studies that suggest that linking the people who spontaneously choose to drink alcohol with reductions in CRP and mortality. So there is the epidemiology there that says this is a credible hypothesis, but it's not proven. We know that consumption of omega-3 fats, particularly the long-chain omega-3s from what typically are called fish oil, but they're found from other sources, that their intake, either epidemiological, but even in 2 prospective studies, the DART study in Britain and the GC study in Italy, demonstrated that you could reduce mortality by 25 to 30% by administering fish oil to high-risk patients. This is not to the average not-risk population, but people who already have had an event in secondary prevention, that fish oil has a significant effect. And the assumption is that the primary effect is due to the anti-inflammatory effect of the long-chain omega-3s. So here we see 25 and 50%. And then a group of people in France, in the city of Lyon, did a study that was published first in 1994 in the preliminary, and then the final study in 1999 in Circulation by Delogerie et al. They used a combination. So here you get to this combination concept. They used fruit, fish, monounsaturated fat, meaning olive oil, wine. So you got 4 different components, and they stacked these components together into what they constructed as a prospectively constructed kind of ideal Mediterranean diet. And they found a 70% reduction in mortality in a secondary prevention trial. So people already had a heart attack, high risk of having another one. Give them this stack of 4 different things together, and they got what looked like a very profound effect. And the experts are still arguing whether this was a fluke or whether this is real. The study has not been refuted, but it hasn't been yet be repeated, but there are people doing this, and we hope to hear about this. But it suggests that, as we all know, nutrition, when they feed you lunch today, they're not going to give you a plate with a pile of protein on it. Or they're not going to give you a plate with a big blob of fat. They're going to give you some combination of proteins, fats, and fruits, and low carbohydrate, vegetables and low carbohydrate fruits, perhaps. You're going to eat a mix of nutrients. And nutrition is about getting the right mix, not about focusing on one single factor. So it really kind of bothers me when people say, oh, you wrote that Atkins book, so you're for a high-protein diet. And I say, no, protein, it's not just about protein, and it's not high. But I'll talk about that a little bit more in the afternoon. So if I was going to put together a formulation, the things I would add would be omega-3 fats, EPA and DHA, or you don't want to know what the long versions of those names are. And they reduce inflammation. Gamma-tocopherol reduces inflammation. The things people call polyphenols, flavonoids, coumarins, anthocyanins, these are the things that give the vegetables and fruit the dark colors. That's a simple way of thinking of it. They also are clearly shown to be in their various forms and combinations to reduce inflammation. Then there are things you want to leave out or minimize. The omega-6 fats. Now the omega-6s are the original essential fats that we get taught about. And we have to have them. In the same way that Dr. Wortman pointed out, LDL is a vital component of human physiology. The important thing is to have the right amount. So we've been told that omega-6 fats are essential, but they're essential in teaspoon quantities, not in the quart of soybean oil that you get in most salad dressings. So we're so bathed in omega-6 fatty acids, and they're predominantly pro-inflammatory when eaten in excess, that we should eat them in very moderate amounts, which means there's so much already in our food chain that we don't need to add any more. In fact, we need to be conscious about not eating too much. Iron, a vital nutrient for humans, but in excess, it's pro-inflammatory. And it drives reactive oxygen species, that is, oxygen-free radicals or oxidative stress is driven by iron, and you don't want to have too much of it. And we physicians write way too many scripts for iron for people who are just a little fatigued when they really don't need the iron. Trans fats we know are bad. Walter Willett proved that they increase CRP, published that in 2004. The fact that we still have some of them available in our diet, I think, is probably criminal. I was going to say about nothing short of criminal, but anyway. And alpha tocopherol, going to the store and buying alpha tocopherol tablets and taking it, what's the harm in that? It's an antioxidant, right? But it antagonizes gamma tocopherol. So the amount of gamma tocopherol that you get naturally occurring in your diet is pushed down by taking alpha tocopherol. And that probably explains why when you look at a meta-analysis of vitamin E intake from high-dose vitamin E studies, you show no benefit. And some courageous people are saying, actually, the data suggests that alpha tocopherol in the large doses of those pills we take actually can do harm. And it may do so because it's antagonizing the anti-inflammatory form, because alpha has no anti-inflammatory effects. Gamma is potently anti-inflammatory. So how about low-carb diets? Because you keep hearing about this, not about drinking wine or whatever. Within the last 8 years, a number of studies with carbohydrate-restricted diets have shown a variety of things, and you've seen this already. They're effective for weight loss. They raise HDL cholesterol. They reduce triglycerides. They reduce the small, dense LDL cholesterol, which is the dangerous form of LDL. We did a study, and I'll show you a little bit of data from that in the afternoon session, on healthy bicyclists back and published it in 1983. And we didn't understand what it meant back then, but we noticed that it dropped their total white blood cell count by 15%. Now, these are highly trained bicycle racers who had very low, had no signs of inflammation, and yet by putting them on a low carbohydrate diet, a ketogenic diet, we saw that their total white blood cell count went from low to even a little bit, not abnormally low, but at the low end of normal to a little lower and still normal. And we couldn't figure out why would the white blood cell count go down in people who had no signs of inflammation. And I'll try to explain that a little bit more in the afternoon with that data. And then the next slide I'm going to show you from a study that was published by Cassandra Forsyth doing her PhD in Dr. Volek's laboratory. And that'll be on the next slide, showing that a high-carb diet for weight loss, compared to a high-carb diet, the low-carb diet reduced 7 of 15 biomarkers of inflammation. Now, the other thing I'll point out is when we do a low-carb diet, oftentimes, as in Cassandra Forsyth's study, she fed them a lot of dark green and colored vegetables and a little bit of dark fruit. But not all the studies, including the one of my bike racers, that one had no vegetables in it for a period or fruit at all for a period of 4 weeks, and yet we saw this reduction. So we're not seeing the anti-inflammatory effect due to phytonutrients. It suggests that the anti-inflammatory effect is due to the low carbohydrate intake in and of itself. And then, as Dr. Wortman pointed out, among the sugars, particularly fructose, increases oxidative stress. Oxidative stress is a promoter of inflammation. And then also the point that high blood insulin level is pro-inflammatory as well. So there are a number of markers, not just that carbohydrate restriction lowers inflammation, but we have a sense of what the mechanism is. And is the effect moderate or is it major? This slide is taken from Dr. Forsyth's PhD dissertation work and published in Lipids back in 2008. But this is the percent change in 7 of these 15 biomarkers. This is IL-6, interleukin 8, TNF-alpha. It's kind of an alphabet soup. But what it shows is the ketogenic diet is the change for people in ketogenic diet compared to the change for the people on low fat. And this shows the ones where the differences between the two diets were significant. Notice that there are no points on this graph where there's a red bar or an orange bar going up and a blue one coming down. It's always the red ones go down more and the blue ones, if anything, go up. And what this means is that compared to a low-fat, high-carbohydrate weight loss diet, and these people were losing weight on this diet over a course of 12 weeks, a low-carbohydrate, high-fat, moderate protein ketogenic diet had a dramatically better effect on multiple biomarkers of inflammation. So this is, in essence, an across-the-board. This is not looking at a single point of green light. This is looking at a rainbow, if you will, of nature's broad spectrum, host defense, anti-inflammatory components in the body. Not driving these things out of the normal range, but taking them from high normal down more towards low normal, meaning comprehensively shifting risk for these myriad of dangerous diseases into a lower range to a, quote, lower idle speed, if you will. Okay, now I know that some of you in the audience are non-technical, but before I do that, there is countervailing data published out there. So I don't want to give you just my side of the story. So let me point out that there was a study, contradictory study, published by a group from Phoenix, I'm sorry, not Phoenix, wherever Arizona State is. Anyway, so Pam Swan's group at Arizona State University, along with Barry Sears. Barry Sears and I have known each other since 1980. That they published a study entitled Ketogenic Low Carbohydrate Diets Have No Metabolic Advantage Over Non-Ketogenic Low Carbohydrate Diets. It's published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 2006. AJCN is a very reputable journal. In fact, at the time, I was on their editorial board. So being on the editorial board, since I have experience in ketogenic diets, you'd think they would send me this manuscript for review, but I never saw this manuscript until it was published, because my former boss, Dr. Charles Halstead, knew that if I reviewed it, I would savage it. So since he didn't want to have it savaged, he didn't send it to me. This is the politics of publication, okay? So what they did in this study was they put people either on the Barry Sears Zone diet, which is their non-ketogenic low carbohydrate diet, which is 40% carbs, or they put them on a, quote, Atkins diet, which is supposed to be only about 25 grams of carbohydrate per day. And they kept them on those diets for 6 weeks. And at the end of the 6 weeks, they compared multiple endpoints, including a inflammation biomarker that Barry Sears hypothesized was valid based on kind of his principles of fatty acid metabolism, that omega-6s are good and omega-3s are all bad. I'm sorry, omega-6s are bad and omega-3s are good. Anyway, long story short, their conclusion was that weight losses on the two diets were not different, and fat losses weren't different after 6 weeks. So no difference between the two diets. They pointed out that blood beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is the primary ketone that circulates when you're in nutritional ketosis, is what's powering me from talking to you at this speed right now, was 3.6 times as great in the low ketogenic diet, was 6 times greater than in the non-ketogenic low carb diet at week 2, and gave you a nice p-value, 0.18. So he's saying, well, here's a ketogenic diet, and they weren't different. But he's showing you ketosis at 2 weeks, but the data that they are comparing is at 6 weeks. At 6 weeks, when you read the manuscript carefully, the beta-hydroxybutyrate levels between the two diets didn't differ at all at 6 weeks when they measured the endpoints. So there's no difference in ketones, and yet their title says the ketogenic diet has no metabolic advantage. But when they measured it, they weren't ketonic. The blood levels were 0.3 millimolar here and 0.2 on Barry's, and those are not statistically significant. Whereas we who have worked in this field have kind of arbitrarily defined the threshold of nutritional ketosis starts at 0.5 millimolar. it goes to about 3 millimolar. So 0.5 to 3, they're measuring at 0.3 and saying, well, it doesn't happen. So the bottom line is, it's easy to prove that nutritional ketosis has no benefits if the diet you study does not cause nutritional ketosis. And this is not the only study like this out there. There was one published in New England Journal a couple of years ago that was said to be a well-formulated low-carb diet, and yet the data in the table misrepresented their intakes by almost twice, but by almost twice as much. So there is countervailing data, but there's the quality science that I think on the other side of this, as references inflammation, not just other outcome parameters, is really not there. So here's what I really want to stress you a little bit in terms of science, because this is a paper published just a little over a year ago, in December of 2012, in the e-version, and it came out in the journal Science, which is probably hands down one of the most reputable research journals in the world. And it's a study done by Eric Verdin's group and about 5,000 other people at University of California, San Francisco. And basically what they were looking at is a class of compounds called histone deacetylases. And histone deacetylases are a group of enzymes that are called gene silencers. These are enzymes that actually do the work of turning genes in our genome on and off. And so if you have active histone deacetylases, and there's a whole panoply of these, because you don't want to turn all genes on and off at the same time. You want to be able to turn different genes selectively on and off with different signals. So you want to look for signals that change the activities of these genes and see what they do. And they took mice, and they compared either fed mice or fasted mice, or here what they did was they actually infused buffer or beta-hydroxybutyrate into mice. So if you fast a mouse, you make its ketones go up. If you surgically implant a pump and infuse ketones, you make their ketones go up. Or if you even just moderately calorically restrict them, you make their ketones go up a bit. And when they compared the infused mice in terms of hydroxynonenal, which was a biomarker of oxidative stress, when you infuse beta-hydroxybutyrate, you make the hydroxynonenal go down very significantly. If you infuse beta-hydroxybutyrate and look at lipid peroxidation products in the liver tissue of these animals, again, you get a very significant reduction in when you infuse beta-hydroxybutyrate. What this says is that beta-hydroxybutyrate, whether it's caused by fasting or infusion, has a potent anti-inflammatory effect and anti-oxidative stress effect. And these are, if this was a drug, it would have $10 billion behind it in developmental funding, because you could just take this. Yeah, this is the blockbuster everybody's looking for, and it turns out to be beta-hydroxybutyrate. And how does it work? Here again. I said there are many of these histone deacetylase enzymes. This is 100% activity of this enzyme when you assay it in the test tube. And then as you add beta-hydroxybutyrate, this is not a linear scale. This is 1, 3, 10, 30, and 100. Now, ketoacidosis happens somewhere starting above 10 up to the range of 30. So when a type 1 diabetic without insulin, they go into ketoacidosis, this is the range of ketoacidosis. But 1 to 3 is the range of nutritional ketosis. And look, for 3 of these 4 enzymes, these are gene quieting enzymes. These are turning off genes. Which genes does this class 1 set do? These genes up here, when they're 100% active, are turning off your internal oxidative stress protection. This is complex. If you quiet those genes, you increase your body's defenses against oxidative stress. So if you want the most potent oxidative stress reduction tool you can find, you want to have your beta-hydroxybutyrate somewhere between 1 and 3. So when we now look at low carbohydrate ketogenic diets, where you actually get in the 1 to 3 range, not the 0.03 like Barry Sears was promoting in his paper, but in the 1 to 3 range, there is a potent drug-like gene signaling effect that protects your body against reactive oxygen species, oxidative stress, and inflammation. This is huge. And I've sent this paper out to probably 100 people, and about 10 of them have said, wow, that's amazing. And the other 90 have said, and the reason they go is because that's going to change our world. You know, if you have stock in Archer Daniels Midland, sell it. You know, they're the biggest publicly traded grain trader. If your last name happens to be Cargill and you live in the western suburbs of Minneapolis, I don't know if you're from Minnesota, but you know, they're the world's largest grain trader and they're privately held. And I can guarantee you they don't like me saying this. So as an internist, I like to leave people with a prescription. You know, I write out and say, here, take this. You know, eat fish 3 times a week. Try to get not long-aged fish that accumulate methylmercury, but short-aged, but cold water, naturally occurring ocean fish. Or if not, take DHA or fish oil. DHA is now produced in basically through growing the actual microalgae which originated in the ocean. Fish don't make DHA. Fish eat a food chain that starts with microalgae that make DHA, and that's how it gets into fish. So people are now growing this stuff there are multiple firms now that make this stuff, and this is what's put into infant formula so the infant's brains and visual function occur normally if they're not getting breast milk. Human breast milk is rich in DHA. Even if the mom's tissue isn't, the mom gives up what she has to the infant. But if you feed an infant a formula, they have to get their DHA because their livers can't make it. Gamma tocopherol, and you can buy it on the internet. There's something called Gamma E that you can buy, and a dose of a couple 100 milligrams per day is completely harmless and probably very beneficial. I have no financial involvement with that. If you drink alcohol, wine in moderation, it looks like wine is probably the best choice. So maybe because not just the alcohol effect, but maybe the polyphenols that you get in the wines. If you choose to eat lots of fat, as I do, olive oil is a good choice. But as you all already heard from Dr. Wortman, the evidence now is that saturated fats are probably good for you, not just not bad for you. But they're probably good. So, you know, if you want olive oil, if you want to have palm oil or coconut oil, or if you actually want to have the fat that comes with the bacon, naturally occurring with the bacon, you can do that too. And I would say that if you have a condition associated with or promoted by inflammation, whether it's metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and cancer, and now we're beginning to see evidence for Alzheimer's disease, then a very low carb ketogenic diet, high in fat, may be your best choice. And with that, I'll shut up and invite you to my local bed and breakfast.